On October 27, 1962, a Soviet missile crew near Sagua La Grande armed a nuclear warhead, while Washington still believed Cuba held only anti-aircraft guns. For 11 days, the sharpest photo interpreters in the United States had stared at clearings in the western Cuban countryside and catalogued them as construction staging for Soviet air defense upgrades. The single 13-day warning window that defined the real Cuban Missile Crisis never opened. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. On October 14, 1962, U-2 pilot Major Richard Heiser photographed a strip of terrain near San Cristobal in western Cuba. The film reached the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington the following morning, where director Arthur Lundahl and senior analyst Dino Brugioni bent over the prints with loops. In our history, Brugioni matched the trapezoidal launch pad signatures to Soviet medium-range ballistic missile installations he had studied in classified manuals on Operation Anadyr deployments. In this alternate record, fatigue, glare on the emulsion, and the distracting clarity of two fresh SA-2 surface-to-air batteries nearby shift his eye. He flags the Star of David pattern of the SA-2 sites and annotates the larger clearings as probable staging yards for additional air defense construction. The brief delivered to National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy on the morning of October 16th therefore reports only a hardening of Cuban air defenses. The memorandum is routed through routine channels. President Kennedy, preparing for a campaign swing to Connecticut, is told that Havana is fortifying, not threatening. But what no one in the Situation Room understands, what will not surface for nearly 2 weeks, is that the trapezoids are already pouring concrete for R-12 pads, and Soviet warheads are moving by rail from the port of Mariel. The rest of October passes in what will later be called the Quiet Fortnight. American attention drifts toward the November midterm elections, the aftermath of James Meredith's admission to the University of Mississippi, and a steel price dispute that still preoccupies the White House economic team. Soviet engineers in Cuba, unmolested by overflights, bring the R-12 sites at Sagua La Grande and Calabazar de Sagua to full operational readiness. Warheads are mated to missiles, checklists are signed off. General Isapliev, commanding approximately 42,000 Soviet personnel on the island, reports to Moscow that the strategic deployment phase of Anadyr is complete. Follow-on U-2 missions, tasked on the basis of the October 16 NPIC assessment, are routed away from the western provinces to avoid the reported SA-2 coverage. Photographic coverage of Pinar del Rio drops to nearly zero. Cuban exile networks pass fragmentary reports of long cylindrical objects on trailers, but without corroborating imagery, the intelligence community files them alongside months of similar, unverifiable rumors. In Washington, the machinery that in our history produced XCOM, the quarantine debate, and the Robert Kennedy back-channel meetings with Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin never activates. There is no crisis to manage because there is no crisis anyone has seen. On the morning of October 27th, a routine U-2 true reconnaissance flight under Major Rudolph Anderson crosses eastern Cuba on a weather and order of battle run. Anderson's track carries him near Baines, where a Soviet S-75 battery, acting under local initiative and without explicit authorization from Moscow, fires 2 V-75 missiles. Anderson is killed. His aircraft breaks apart over the Oriente coast. Recovery of the wreckage, including a partially intact camera magazine, produces the first imagery the United States has ever seen of fully assembled R-12 launch complexes. Within hours, NPIC analysts are measuring trapezoidal arrangements on prints that cannot be explained as SA-2 geometry. Arthur Lundahl walks the revised assessment to the White House himself. The scale of Operation Anadyr, concealed for 11 weeks and uncorrected for 13 days, lands on President Kennedy's desk as a single sheet of photographic evidence and a casualty notification. There is no window left for a quarantine, no time to open a back channel, no 13 days of deliberation. The missiles are already armed. The Joint Chiefs present O-Plan 312 within hours. Maxwell Taylor and Curtis LeMay argue that every minute of delay increases the probability of a Soviet launch order reaching Cuba. Robert McNamara, in Our History, the Voice of Restraint, has no 13 days of exhausted alternatives behind him and no diplomatic architecture to defend. Kennedy authorizes the strike before dawn on October 28th. More than 500 sorties lift off from Florida bases and the carriers Enterprise and Independence. They hit the missile sites at San Cristobal, Sagua La Grande, and Remedios, the Soviet barracks complexes, and the Cuban airfields at San Antonio de los Baños and Santa Clara. The attack succeeds in destroying most R-12s on their pads. But it also confirms General Pliev's worst expectation: cut off from Moscow by jammed communications and operating under the pre-delegated authority Khrushchev had granted him in the summer. Pliev orders the surviving Lunar tactical rocket and FKR-1 cruise missile crews to fire on the invasion fleet assembling off Key West. Nuclear warheads detonate at sea. The threshold has been crossed. In the cabinet room, Kennedy is told that American destroyers have been struck by atomic weapons. The distinction between conventional and nuclear war, maintained in theory since 1945, has collapsed within a single morning. Strategic Air Command is ordered to DEFCON 1. Kennedy authorizes a limited nuclear strike on Soviet forces in Cuba, targeting the remaining lunar sites and Pliev's command bunkers with tactical atomic weapons. 4 R-12 missiles survive long enough to launch before their pads are destroyed. Their targeting has been preloaded against southeastern American cities. 1 airburst detonates over Miami. 1 strikes the Naval Air Station at Jacksonville. 2 fall short into the Atlantic. Within 90 minutes, the United States has suffered nuclear attack on its own soil for the first time in its history, and Cuba has been struck by American atomic weapons. And then came the moment that would determine whether the war remained narrow or consumed everything. Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missiles from bases in Ukraine and the western military districts strike the Jupiter installations at Izmir in Turkey and the Thor sites in eastern England. The salvos are limited, aimed at the forward-based systems that had become symbolic irritants throughout 1962. In the North Atlantic, a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine torpedoes an American destroyer participating in the Cuban cordon. Both strikes are, by the standards of strategic doctrine, restrained. In Moscow, Khrushchev refuses to authorize a general release against American cities. In Washington, Kennedy, staring at casualty estimates from Miami and Jacksonville that already exceed anything in American military history, refuses to authorize retaliation against the Soviet homeland. The two capitals, recoiling from the scale of civilian losses, open a fragile emergency channel through the Swiss embassy in Washington and the Indian embassy in Moscow. The channel holds. By the morning of October 30th, a ceasefire is in place. The strategic arsenals, the weapons that would have ended civilization, remain in their silos. Miami and Jacksonville are evacuated and quarantined. The radiological survey teams that enter the outer wards operate in conditions no American responder has trained for. The eventual death toll, combining immediate casualties and those lost to acute radiation exposure in the weeks that follow, is estimated at approximately 340,000 American lives. Losses among Soviet personnel in Cuba and Cuban civilians are never fully accounted for, though they are understood to be comparable. Congressional inquiries begin in January 1963. The Church and Fulbright hearings dissect the failure of photographic interpretation with an exactness that transforms the career of every analyst who sat at the NPIC light tables that October. Dino Brugioni testifies for 3 days. Arthur Lundahl testifies for 4. The hearings produce the Intelligence Reform Act of 1963, which separates imagery analysis from operational pressure and requires dissenting interpretations to be preserved in the record. Kennedy declines to seek re-election. The 1964 campaign is fought over civil defense, intelligence reform, and a proposed constitutional amendment restricting the executive's authority to employ nuclear weapons without congressional consultation. A Vienna Accord signed in the summer of 1965 establishes the mutual withdrawal of forward-based missile systems, a permanent direct communications link between the two capitals, and international inspection of overseas deployments under United Nations auspices. The treaty is ratified by both superpowers within a year. The shock of a war that neither government had wanted, triggered by a single photo-interpretive error, and sustained by the absence of the 13 days that did not happen, drives an early and unexpected détente. It also produces a generation of American isolationism. Southeast Asia, in this timeline, is left to regional powers. The Middle East is ceded to British and French residual influence, and to the emerging ambitions of Nasser and the Shah. The United States turns inward, rebuilding two cities and an intelligence apparatus, and spends the remainder of the decade arguing over what a republic owes its citizens when their government fails to see what is already there. The trapezoidal clearings at San Cristobal, photographed on October 14th and dismissed on October 16th, remain the single most studied set of images in the history of American intelligence. They are a reminder that the margin between catastrophe and a managed crisis can be as narrow as the distinction between two geometric patterns seen by a tired analyst under a desk lamp in the early hours of a Tuesday morning.